welcome back to our Inquirers series. Last video I talked about why Christian, and now we're going to narrow that focus to why Episcopalian. Why is it that we claim this particular tradition as our expression of Christianity? Well, of course we all know why the Episcopal Church started, or how it started, right? It's because Henry VIII wanted a divorce, right? The 1530s, he got tired of being married to Catherine of Aragon because she wasn't producing a son for him. They didn't have this little thing as genetics known back then, where it's actually his fault that he was not having a son. Well, and then he decided, of course, that because the church, the Roman Catholic Church, would not grant him a divorce, he was just going to start his own church. And that's the end of it. Well, if we want to hold that position, then we could say the Lutheran Church started because Martin Luther decided to post on the bulletin board one day. The Methodist Church started because John Wesley thought Anglican worship had gotten boring in the colonies. And we can even say the Roman Catholic Church started or became to prominence when the early bishops of Rome kowtowed to the emperors of the Roman Empire and tried to placate them to make sure that they were not victims of the persecutions that took place. All of that might be some nuggets of truth in all of those, but obviously, just like with the story of the formation of the Anglican Church, why that is called that here in just a moment, but it simplifies greatly and downplays the fact that in all of those circumstances, and in our case, the Anglican tradition started because of other things that were happening at the time, and there's this little thing that God was moving in the midst of this in various ways that we can and sometimes cannot understand. So when Henry wanted his divorce, there was this little movement on the continent of Europe called the Protestant Reformation that was taking place. Martin Luther decided to nail 95 protests, or theses as he called them, to the door of a cathedral in Wittenberg, which was his idea of calling out abuses and errors of the Roman Catholic Church. He didn't want to start a new church, at least initially. He wanted to reform what was going on. But because of various political forces that were taking place in Europe, his movement was picked up by others who very much indeed wanted to break off from Rome and start their own Christian church and tradition. Well, Henry had, ironically, no interest in starting his own church, except for one notable thing. He wanted to be the head of it. And so when the Pope would not grant him an annulment, he brought in an Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who, as you'll hear in just a moment, became a fairly important member of the Church of England and in its origins. Cranmer granted the annulment, independent of the Pope in Rome. But in the meantime, Henry, now becoming the head of the Church of England, still very much wanted to keep the faith Catholic in all of its forms, except for its ultimate obedience to the Pope in Rome. Well, when Henry died in 1547, his son, Edward VI, as a teenager, rose to power. And while sometimes he is often accused of simply being manipulated by his advisors, Edward himself was known to be a strong advocate for the Protestant faith, which was coming to fruition in circles within England. And so Edward, within a couple of years, Thomas Cranmer, still his Archbishop of Canterbury, Cranmer helped to create, the architect of something that is very important to us as Episcopalians nowadays, called the Book of Common Prayer. This happens to be the 1662 version, the year 1662 of the Book of Common Prayer. This was 1549 when Edward allowed Cranmer to develop the first prayer book. He created a revision which was even more Protestant-leaning in 1552, and all was going well for the Protestant Reformation in England until Edward got ill and died in 1553. His oldest sister, Mary, who was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and because of Catherine's Spanish roots, was very loyal and raised within the Roman Catholic Church, decided to cut off the Protestant Reformation in England and try to return England back to the Roman Catholic Church. She executed Thomas Cranmer along with others, and in those 5 years she was queen, almost fully restored the church to its roots in Roman Catholicism, but her health then failed, and in 1558 she died, and her sister Elizabeth I became the queen. And for the next 45 years, England went through a golden age in which politically and militarily it thrived, but also its church, the Church of England, or what is called the Anglican Church, took its form that it now has today. Elizabeth promoted what we call a via media, or middle way, which is not simply just one path in the middle of others, but rather this wide range of different expressions of liturgical belief and doctrinal belief that essentially cut out two extremes. One was the Puritans, who wanted rejection of everything related to Rome and any trappings of Rome, such as robes and vestments or altars or wine, even in communion, all of the things that were distractions of focus upon the Word of the Bible and the Word alone. And on the other extreme, Roman Catholics who, wanted to take the church back to Rome, as Mary had tried to do during her reign. But in between those two extremes, the Anglican Church began to show a remarkable display of diversity in its liturgical and doctrinal outlook. And Elizabeth continued that tradition until her death in 1603. The Church continued to thrive and grow, with the notable interruption of about 10 years in the middle of the 17th century when the Protestant Revolution took place. But when Charles II restored the monarchy in the 1660s, the Anglican Church returned. And this prayer book, the 1662 prayer book, was the book of the restoration of the monarchy and the Church, and remains today the official prayer book of the Church of England in the United Kingdom to this day. Now, during that time in the 17th century, there was this little thing called colonization, which was taking place, and one particular land called the Americas, where English settlers were going. And of course, again, the diversity of the Reformation meant Puritans, Pilgrims, peoples of different expressions of Protestant beliefs were going over to the Americas, but also a great number of people who still claimed loyalty and faithfulness to the Church of England, the Anglican Church, were settling in the Americas, particularly in the southern colonies. And the Anglican Church continued to thrive until the Revolution. When the Revolution came, typical of the Anglican way, there was a wide variety of people who were extremely loyal in all ways to not only the Anglican Church, but to the monarchy in general, who were called Tories. And there were people who, while still professing their worship within the Anglican Church, wanted that church as well as their country, or their blooming country, to separate all of its other ties from England. Well, you know which side won. But there was a little problem with the Church of England, whose head of the church was the monarch. How could you have that within the new United States that was forming? Well, the solution to that was, instead of the monarch as the head of state, was to ordain bishops as the head of the church. But the English were not too keen on consecrating bishops. In other words, you had to have an existing bishop consecrate a new bishop. The English bishops were like, no, we're not going to do that. Well, a few American priests found a welcome audience in the Scottish Episcopal Church, what was called the non-juring church, and these Scottish bishops ordained several people to the episcopacy in the American church, and by that it got its name not anymore as the Church of England, but as the Episcopal Church, which means literally of bishops. But the Episcopal Church wasn't just a church of bishops. It mirrored the formation of the government of the United States in the fact that it created a national legislature that was bicameral, one called the House of Bishops and one called the House of Deputies, which was the gathering of lay and non-bishop clergy leaders who would gather together to pass doctrine and administrative oversight of the church. That body met in 1789 and elected Bishop of Pennsylvania William White as its first presiding bishop, who, unlike the Pope, who had final say in all things, the presiding bishop was what the name implies. He presided over the gathering of what became known as General Convention, but otherwise was more of an advisory role, and in fact William White maintained his seat as the Bishop of Pennsylvania for decades until his death. The Episcopal Church, in its governance, formed a body that worked together between the pastoral oversight of bishops and the legislative process, which helped to create the way in which churches on local levels formed within vestries, which were the local bodies which governed each congregation, dioceses, which were overseen by the bishop, but then the working together of all the dioceses together in this general convention. So, that's all the governance of the church, and you're like, well, that's great, but what is it about the Episcopal Church? That's how y'all run things. why should I be an Episcopalian? Well, the Episcopal Church, as I said, the middle way, the idea of having different variations within two extremes of doctrine and liturgy, among other things. Well, actually, those two extremes, beginning in the 19th century, really also began to become part of the Episcopal Church. You had people who were part of what was called the High Church movement, who wanted to bring back pretty much every vestige of Roman Catholicism, with the exception of allegiance to the Pope. And during the period in the United States called the Great Awakening, you had people who wanted to have it essentially look like a Puritan church, albeit with sacraments and a few little rituals that help guide the life of the church. Even today, I went to seminary in the Diocese of Virginia, which is considered low church, which means priests didn't wear many vestments. You had an altar that was very small, a pulpit that literally in one church that I attended one time was 25 feet above the floor. Gee, I wonder what's important in that church. And then you can go to churches in another town, and in fact in Virginia you could go into Washington, D.C. to high Anglo-Catholic churches where the priest chanted the entire service, they swung incense, and they had a very high understanding of communion as being not only the central part of the worship, but communion was even adored and venerated as it is done in many Roman Catholic traditions. All of these churches today call themselves Episcopal churches, and that is because despite the diversity of worship, they are all united by the same liturgy that falls in this Book of Common Prayer, which gives churches the flexibility to act with rituals that are fairly minimal or fairly ornate, depending on the culture and the style of worship that that congregation prefers. One of the other elements of why being an Episcopalian is such a wonderful thing is our doctrine is shaped by not just a focus on Scripture alone. Scripture has the primary focus of our life together, but there's this thing called the three-legged stool, somewhat misinterpreted because it implies that all three of the legs are the same. Scripture's the primary one, but we recognize tradition, which carries all of the 2,000 years of church history, and when we deal with things and conflicts within the church and with society, we can go back and see how did the church handle those things in those times. Reason is the other part of that three-legged stool, which says it's not just we think our way through things, but God has given us the ability to interpret how God is revealing Christ and the Spirit to us in the context of things we struggle with today. A great example and a huge thing that is going on in the Episcopal Church today is how do we care for creation in a world in which the population is growing exponentially day by day, resources are becoming scarcer, global warming is running rampant, climate change. The way that we treat our planet has become not just a crisis of humanity, but a crisis of faith. Reason helps us to look through Scripture and tradition and to come up with ways in how God is calling us to deal with this crisis as people of faith and not just as human beings in general. The Episcopal Church has a wide diversity of understanding. We've ordained women, which it was actually not that long ago that we ordained women to the priesthood, but that has been the case for the last 45 years in our life as the church. We have become much more accepting, although we're not fully there yet, of LGBT people into the life and ministry of the church. We are a church that strives, at least in theory, and we sometimes struggle in practice to be inclusive, but perhaps above all of those things is that we tell people when you come to a church, you do not have to ascribe to hundreds of pages of doctrine, but rather you can simply come to the church, immerse yourself in the worship and life of the church, but also ask questions. Bring your doubts. Don't linger in them, but bring your doubts and understand that part of our life together as Episcopalians is the realization that we don't have it all figured out, and that's okay. We recognize that God does not fully reveal the entirety of God's plans to all people. We're still trying to figure that out, but we do hold to the principal doctrines of belief in Jesus, the death and resurrection and ascension of Christ, all the things laid out in the creeds and the traditions of the church. But within those boundaries, we are able to explore the ways in which God is revealing the ways in which we are called to practice our faith in the world. More will be shared on that in a video to come. So what I would ask you to do is to ask yourself the question, what is it about the Episcopal Church that has attracted you here? What is it that you want to learn more about? You can ask those in the comments or in our time together as Inquirers where we will gather in person. But with this short, very brief history that I've given you of so much that has happened in the formation of our life as the Anglican Communion, the gathering of the Church of England in all parts of the world where colonists went and established churches that in all of their cultural differences still use a Book of Common Prayer as their guide to worship and life together. What is it that you want to know, and what is it that you appreciate about our tradition? I really look forward to hearing your answers to this, as it will help me, in particular, continue to grow as a priest and in my own journey as to why I continue to love to be an Episcopalian. Thank you, and see you later.